Hello, my name is S.K. Williams, and today I would like to talk to you about institutional capture. Because at this point, it is not a conspiracy theory. Everyone knows it. Certain people pretend not to know it because it is advantageous for them to maintain the myth, the narrative that such is a conspiracy theory because it benefits them. They're on the side that did the institutional capture. But everyone knows that over the last 30 or so years, various institutions have become controlled by highly progressive, highly motivated people. And people have begun to realize something I was saying years ago during the New Atheism, that you don't need the conspiracy to work like it does in the movies, or how people, at least at the time, imagine these conspiracies to work. You don't need some literal or proverbial dark lord at the center and a group of robed men in a smoke-filled back room standing around a pentagram chanting incantations to the devil, or even in a sort of boardroom environment. All you really need is a network of interconnected people with similar ideals and goals. Although, to be fair, when it comes to this sort of institutional capture that we see, we sort of have a hybrid between these two scenarios. There really were meetings of intellectual figures who try to drive society toward a certain direction, but most of the conspirators were not simply brought into a shadowy organization and given orders by a specific person or group of people. Most of the people did so automatically, whilst being influenced by going to things like conferences. And before I continue, I would like to apologize for my voice. I'm not feeling very well, so ironically, a couple of videos that will come out after this will actually have me sound more normal while I'm still sick, probably, because I pre-recorded them. But having said that, I've been saying for a long time that there have been institutions that exist largely out of sight of the public. But they don't exist as clandestine organizations which deliberately hide and keep secret, but rather they're publicly known, but very few people know about them. They don't advertise because they don't need to. Because the mere suggestion that these organizations exist sounds preposterous and absurd to people, and people who align with these organizations or even know that they exist will mock you for even suggesting that they exist. And that seems to be enough because people didn't really look into it. They just listened to the mockery and accepted that the idea that these sorts of organizations exist is ridiculous. I know that firsthand because when the New Atheism was new, I would point out that the New Atheists all work through the same or related organizations, like American Atheists or the National Secular Society in Britain or the American Humanist Association. And you had a group of atheist organizations that were sometimes recognized as existing and motivational and sometimes not. But there was this odd tendency when one was to debate an atheist, that you saw that atheist as an individual who just lacked belief in a God, nothing more. We all knew that this wasn't true. We all knew that they were going to repeat the same arguments that were being circulated during the new atheism that are largely still circulated today. If you talk to a militant atheist who talks about how evil religion is, they always say exactly the same things. You know exactly how the conversation is going to go with them. But everyone played along that atheists were individuals, that religious people might all talk the same, and probably do, because they've been indoctrinated and have dogma and all that. And even the religious people themselves admitted this, because religious people means Christian in this sort of discussion, and Christians believe the Bible and what their church teaches, but atheists have nothing in common with other atheists but their lack of belief in a God. And we all knew that this was fake, and we still do. It's not even really true in the abstract that atheism is a mere lack of belief in a God. That definition of atheism was invented by Antony Flew back in the 1970s. And I say that knowing that other people pointed that out and it's been proven false, and that people like Rationality Rules have done videos exposing that as a lie and proving historical atheists defined atheism as a lack of belief in a God, and with quotes proving that Bertrand Russell thought of atheism as a lack of belief in a God, and Robert Ingersoll understood it as the atheism as a lack of belief in a God, and Charles Bradlaugh understood atheism as a lack of belief in a God, and they didn't. None of the quotes that supposedly proved that atheism was always understood as a lack of belief in a God actually say that atheism is a lack of belief in a God. They read that definition into a certain cherry-picked quotes. It's rather like proving that Adolf Hitler was a devout Christian by cherry-picking quotes and trying to fit those quotes into a modern American frame, such as when he said that the schools should retain a certain degree of religious education. And this isn't an exact quote, it's off the top of my head, but Mr. I am the great leader of Germania said that schools should have a religious character and they should have religious education. And this is why a lot of people in America who are atheists would say that he shut down public schools and turned over education to the Catholic Church because Mr. Leader of Germania was a devout Catholic and the Catholic Church adored him and he wanted everything to be Catholic, and of course the opposite was the truth. The mustachioed leader of Germania in the mid-century of the 20th wasn't saying that public schools should be shut down and all education shall be turned over to the Catholic Church. And in fact, he didn't do that. If anything, he was shutting down the Catholic schools to have governmental ones. But in Europe, the word public school versus private school don't mean the same thing. In the UK, for example, if you mention public school, you're not talking about the taxpayer-funded general education for everyone. You're talking about what America would call a private school. And what Americans call a public school is a state school. And that's closer to what Leader of Germany was saying. And when they talk about religious education, they're talking about having religious education in the normal state schools, much like the UK has, and much like most of Europe had at the time. This is quite different than how America's schools run, and for some reason, atheists in America project America's school system onto mid-century 20th German schools. which is how they create the illusion that Germania leader was somehow this devout Catholic who was promoting Catholicism. And you'll notice that a lot of the myth-making that happened during the New Atheism happens by cherry-picking select quotations and assuming that what things are like or what words mean in the modern world can be projected backwards, and committing certain category errors and looking for ways to assign their enemies, like the Catholic Church or Christianity in general, to certain other negative traits. And by no means is this limited to atheists or even to progressives. Conservatives do the same thing quite often, though I will say that conservatives in the present day are less guilty of this than progressives, in the sense that they don't take it as far, and they do at least have some checks on their reasoning. It's easier for me to talk about historical errors with conservatives who are making them generally than with progressives. But there are exceptions. There are some conservatives who won't listen to historical corrections, and there are some progressives who will. But progressives today have gotten very fervent, and they need their narrative to justify what they're doing. And that's, like I said, that's a typical problem with humanity. Conservatives, for instance, will often depict the American Revolution through the lens of what modern conservatives are fighting, to say that they're standing with the Founding Fathers. Progressives do the same thing. AOC, for instance, claimed that America's Founding Fathers were fighting the billionaires of their day to depict the American Revolution as a sort of socialist revolution against the rich. But then Matt Walsh responded to that, saying that in reality, America's Founding Fathers were the richest men in the colonies, which was true. Matt Walsh was right about that. They weren't fighting the billionaires of their day. And that was also correct. But then Matt Walsh said that they were actually fighting big government statism, which is what modern progressives want. And that's a lie. The British government was not a big government, statist government in the 18th century, and the actual issues that caused the American Revolution don't map on the modern political scale at all, because they dealt with the relationship between the colonies and Parliament, not between a separate nation of America, which was distinct from Britain, and its federal model that at the time did not exist. And big government statism really didn't exist in the 18th century to begin with. So when Matt Walsh corrected AOC, he was partially correct, in that she was wrong to say that they were fighting the billionaires of their day. But he was wrong to project his own conservative villains, the big government statist, onto a past where it didn't belong either. But in both cases, you see the same tendency of taking historical heroes like America's Founding Fathers, these men who gave us liberty and broke us from tyranny and created the greatest country in the world has ever seen, based upon the greatest ideology the world has ever known, the true nature of man being unleashed, and gave us the greatest document written by human hands, the U.S. Constitution, and then attributing to them modern causes that align with their current political struggle, to basically say that they are continuing the revolution, standing by the Founding Fathers, fighting the tyranny. This is why progressives have no king's protests and talk about King Donald Trump, who's ripped up the Constitution and made himself a king. Because in the American imagination, kings are tyrants, and humans are ultimately narrative and myth-making animals who think in terms of the stories they tell themselves. That's why fiction is important, and why Hollywood needed to change the nature of the films it was telling us to create a progressive future as well. It's They like instilling these messages and ideals in the stories we tell. But very few people actually look at the origins of the ideologies. And when they do, they look at historical people like the Neo-Hegelians, although they don't look at the Neo-Hegelians. They look at Hegel himself. And more and more people are doing what I did and looking at historical lines, although they do it with progressives, not so much with atheists, which is strange because the atheist movement is deeply tied to progressives, even though it lies about how it has nothing to do with politics and atheists can be general and claim that the religious over and right wing because religion indoctrinates you into conservative values, but atheists who think for themselves are more politically diverse, which is clearly not true. Atheists are not clearly more politically diverse than the religious people. In fact, the atheists are religious. The modern atheist movement is basically trying to promote secular humanism. And if you read the Humanist Manifestos, you'll know what they're going to promote, and you know what progressives are going to promote. They're just not honest about that. But therein lies the point. We really can't get rid of the modern excesses of the progressive movement. We can trim it back, but the root will always be there because we're not addressing the taproot of it. We are instead bound to the very thing that gives it life. America's founding fathers, the Enlightenment principles. We just interpret those to mean something that they don't mean. And we don't question the anthropology that comes from the Enlightenment, even if one is a modern conservative, because we're thinking of the world in terms of Burke and Kant, rather than in the terms of Aquinas or Aristotle. This is why modern conservatives have a highly materialist view of economic matters and human socialization. They overlay it, often, if they are Christians, with certain theological models. And to be fair, the actual beliefs we have do come out of a theological perspective. Because even secular humanism actually grew out of Christianity, even though people like A.C. Grayling and Tim Whitmarsh don't like that fact and claim that secular humanism was actually invented by ancient Greece and Rome before Christianity came along, and if anything, Christianity took ideas from secular humanism, but that's just not the case. The ancient Greeks and Romans were not secular humanists, nor were the philosophers of Greece remotely like the modern secular humanists. And secular humanism developed in the 19th century out of ideas that came out of the Enlightenment, which were ideas that largely came out of a Christian culture. There's a reason why we don't see this emerging in India, for instance, even though some atheists like pointing to this or that historical Indian atheist philosopher who embraced materialism as also humanist when they really weren't either. And that's because they ultimately derive their ideas from the same philosophical foundation, and there really isn't a difference between religion and philosophy. Our culture has created a clear distinction between the two that doesn't really exist. And religious beliefs are philosophies that we live by. And people who are not religious, but nevertheless embrace certain philosophical views, the non-religious philosophical views, are really engaged in religious thinking. They just don't admit that. And that's actually one of the problems that people have with understanding this. Because what is actually happening to our society is the direct consequence of the anthropology and ontology that we have embraced. And they're an anthropology and an ontology that are fundamentally false. And yet both conservatives and liberals embrace them implicitly, even if they're not doing so consciously. For instance, you might have a conservative Christian, and I say conservative Christian, not Christian conservative, because Christian is supposed to be their primary identity, not just the modifier to it. I've always hated it when people call me a Christian conservative, because that assumes that I'm a conservative who happens to be a Christian, but my core identity is conservative, when that isn't true. My core identity would be Christian, not conservative. But the point that I'm making is, a lot of conservatives who are Christians like Matt Walsh, like, to an extent, Michael Knowles, although I think Knowles is not as bad about this as some of the others, like David Barton, like Glenn Beck, even like J.P. Spears or Tucker Carlson, even though there's a falling out between these groups, it doesn't really matter. And any of the others you could name, they say that they are Christian, and some even say that they're Catholic. And they don't act like it. And that's in part because the Church at Vatican II modernized when it comes to Catholicism, but also because in order to embrace the traditional Christian view, as it truly was, is to reject certain concepts that form a bedrock in the way modern conservatives understand the world. And those bedrocks are not bedrock principles that conservatives hold that disagree with Christianity, but that liberals do not. I'm not making the argument that actually the left is closer to traditional Christianity. It's not. These are things that are assumed by both the right and left to be true. There are common frames of references used by both of them, even when they have divergent views elsewhere. And they're concepts that largely go under the radar. We don't debate them or discuss them. But that ultimately generate things like capitalism and socialism. And our culture believes that those are the only two options. You're either a capitalist or you're a socialist. You might be able to be in the middle where you blend capitalism and socialism somehow. But those are the only two options that are available to us, and they shouldn't be, because there are other economic models besides capitalism and socialism. But both capitalism and socialism rest on a materialist assumption that the universe we live in is a purely material world. And it also assumes that all needs of man are ultimately material needs. And that society functions as an engine for economic development. I disagree with this. I think that this entire view is dehumanizing, which is ironic because it came out of the Enlightenment, which is supposed to free humanity to be itself, but it never succeeded in that, because it is based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what humans actually are. Humans are not primarily economic machines. And you can't just provide humans with their material comforts and expect all crime to disappear and all poverty to disappear. That's the mistake the left is making. But the mistake the right is making is to assume that allowing people to control their own private wealth in exchange for having to work for it will produce the same results. And there are benefits to the conservative model over the liberal one, but there is still a foundational error in thinking of humanity as a purely material being with purely material needs. Even if you overlay it with the concept that when you die you go to heaven, or that God exists and controls the world somehow, there is a sort of atheistic view at the heart of this, that even people who profess to be Christian and aren't atheists in the formal sense don't quite have a way of reconciling how God works through nature with the material assumptions of nature that they're making. And this fundamental misunderstanding is what gives rise to the modern society that is endlessly at war with itself. Especially since we've lionized rebellion as good. Rebels are heroes who stand up to tyranny. This is never really true historically, even with the American Revolution, and I know that America is celebrating its 250th birthday this year, but America's founding fathers weren't the heroes standing up to tyranny that we say that they were. King George III was not this absolute monarch ruling as a tyrant, claiming a divine right of kings, who put a lot of oppressive laws on people. He was actually a constitutionally limited monarch. The concept of the divine right of kings that people keep bringing up didn't really exist in British law. Even if it did, it doesn't mean what people today think it means. The divine right of kings concept doesn't say that the king has been given power by God, therefore can do whatever he wants. It's not that simple, but it doesn't matter because King George III didn't claim a divine right. King George III was actually only king at the discretion of Parliament because Britain operated on the doctrine of parliamentary supremacy. And then after the Revolution, the king was fully discredited, and we got modern British system where Parliament just does whatever it wants, with no checks. Which is ironic, because now Americans will point to the modern British system and say, that's why America's founders broke from it. Boy, I'm glad we don't have a king! Without realizing that the American Revolution created modern Britain. The American Revolution was more than just America separating from Britain. It created a worldwide rupture in how people think. That's why the modern world endlessly talks about democracy, and why the only legitimate form of government today is a democratic one. And therein lies another problem with the anthropology that we use to understand the world today. We have this idea that hierarchy is bad, that having someone above another person is bad. We should all be equals, and that power should stem from the bottom up. Today's conservatives sometimes reject the wording. You see more and more modern conservatives talking about how hierarchy is actually good, but they don't really mean it. Because at the end of the day, they still want power to come from the bottom up, and for the will of the people to be supreme over everything else, and have an understanding that legitimacy comes from the people, which is actually a bottom-up rather than top-down system. And that's ultimately why things like families unravel. Why is it that I should obey my father in a natural hierarchy, but then reject a king? Why is a king an unnatural hierarchy and bad for me, Why is it that society should work as a society of brothers, but then I should obey a father? And as much as a conservative may say there's difference and it's self-evidently wrong for me to say that, this is exactly how the left approaches it, and it's exactly where the logic leads. Because if we are all equal, that means I'm equal to my father. He is not above me. If all power comes from the will of the people, that means that the majority of people should get what they want, regardless of what it is. The ideas that came out of the Enlightenment got to where they are through acts of political violence, which is weird because today we're seeing political violence erupting, and then people are saying there is no justification for political violence. You should never use political violence for social change. And then they'll say, America, celebrating 250 years. America was born out of political violence against minor taxation, which, even if you think the taxation was unjust, was not so high or so onerous that it justified taking a single human life. Britain wasn't even raising taxes just to send money to the king. It was to pay for colonial defense and to pay off a war debt that the colonies had incurred. Even if you thought that it was wrong for Parliament to levy the taxes or find some other problem, the taxes were low. All historians agree with that. Parliament was willing to negotiate with the colonies. And the war was simply not justified, especially considering that when the taxes were first implemented, people rioted and murdered people. That's no different than the modern left-wing mobs today. But what does all this have to do with institutional capture? Well, I agree that the modern world has been ideologically captured by progressives. Academia, the media, entertainment industry, various non-governmental organizations, and various government bureaucratic departments are all controlled by progressives. But at the same time, if conservatives captured them, progressives would eventually take them back over. Because conservatives today are just half-measure progressives holding to the same anthropology and the same ontology of a purely material world with purely material and economic solutions to all of the problems that we have. You can't solve the ideological capture until you question the Enlightenment, and you can't question the Enlightenment unless you're willing to question the foundational philosophy that America was founded on. That we should have a Republican form of government, that power comes from we the people up, that ultimately there should be no social hierarchies. These philosophical beliefs will guarantee progressivism always grows back when we cut it back. Progressivism can't stand because it goes insane with these ideas. These ideas are in fact insane. But it will always grow back in the fertile soil, so long as we keep the root alive. I don't have much else to say, so I shall take my leave of you now. Thank you, God bless, and goodbye.